The harsh scrape of metal against concrete echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood as Mike Reynolds supervised the removal of his above-ground swimming pool. At 43, with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines that crinkled when he smiled, Mike had finally made the decision after 3 summers of barely using the 15-foot diameter pool that had become more of a maintenance burden than a source of enjoyment. "Careful with that section," he called to the workers, wiping sweat from his brow in the unseasonable spring heat. "The liner's still good if anyone wants it." It was just past 10 in the morning when Mike noticed a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. His neighbor, Diane Winters, or as the neighborhood had taken to calling her behind closed doors, Karen, was marching across her perfectly manicured lawn toward his property line, her face contorted in what could only be described as righteous indignation. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Her voice carried across the yard like an air horn, causing the workers to pause momentarily. Mike sighed. He should have expected this. In the 5 years since Diane had moved into the neighborhood, she'd appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of her personal standards, which rarely aligned with anyone else's priorities or rights. "Morning, Diane," Mike said, forcing a polite smile. "Just having the pool removed. It's been eating up my weekends with maintenance." Diane's eyes narrowed, her blonde bob haircut seeming to bristle with electricity. "You can't do that. My children use that pool." Mike blinked, genuinely confused. "Your children? Diane, they've never once been in my pool. I've never invited them to use my pool. They look at it from their bedroom windows. It's part of their view. They'll be devastated." She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair. The absurdity of the situation might have been comical if it weren't actually happening. Mike glanced at the workers who were exchanging knowing looks. This wasn't their first encounter with a boundary-challenged neighbor. "I'm sorry, but that's not really my concern," Mike said, his tone still even. "It's my yard, my pool, and my decision." "Do you know how much this will lower my property values?" Diane's voice rose an octave. "A pool is a selling point for the entire neighborhood. The homeowners association will hear about this." Mike took a deep breath. The HOA had been Diane's favorite threat since she'd managed to get herself elected as vice president last year. "Diane, there's nothing in the HOA regulations about removing a personal pool from private property. I checked before scheduling this." Her face flushed a deeper shade of crimson. "Well, there should be. This is completely inconsiderate. What's next? Will you let your lawn go to seed? Plant vegetables in the front yard." She said vegetables as though it were a profanity. One of the workers, a burly man named Carlos who had been quietly dismantling the pool frame, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, we need to continue working if we're going to finish today." "You stay out of this," Diane snapped before turning back to Mike. "I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting. This is unacceptable." As she stormed back to her house, phone already pressed to her ear, Mike could only shake his head. He'd known Diane was difficult, but this was a new level of entitlement. What he had assumed would be a straightforward home improvement decision had just become the opening salvo in what promised to be a neighborhood battle. "Sorry about that," Mike said to the workers. Carlos shrugged. "Not our first rodeo with angry neighbors. But man, she's something else." Mike nodded, watching as Diane paced her front porch, gesticulating wildly into her phone. He had a sinking feeling that removing his unused pool was going to prove far more complicated than he'd anticipated. But if there was one thing Mike Reynolds wasn't known for, it was backing down when he knew he was in the right. And this was definitely one of those times. By late afternoon, the pool was gone. What remained was a perfect circle of dead grass and compressed earth, a testament to 3 summers of chlorinated water and minimal use. Mike stood in his backyard, surveying the space with a sense of liberation. He was already envisioning a patio with a fire pit, perhaps some raised garden beds. The possibilities seemed endless. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Looking down, he saw it was a text from his next-door neighbor, Tom Chen. "Heads up, Diane's on the warpath. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow evening." Mike groaned, but he wasn't surprised. He typed back a quick thanks for the warning before slipping his phone back into his pocket. As if on cue, the distinctive sound of a printer wearing to life caught his attention. Through the kitchen window, he could see Diane stapling papers to wooden stakes in her garage. 20 minutes later, every house in the cul-de-sac had a flyer stabbed into their front lawn announcing an urgent community meeting, property values at risk. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the next day at Diane's house. "Subtle," Mike muttered, pulling the stake from his own lawn and reading the flyer with a mixture of amusement and irritation. The text was a masterclass in hyperbole, suggesting that Mike's selfish destruction of community amenities was the first step toward neighborhood decay. His phone rang. This time it was Lisa, his sister. "So what's this I hear about you destroying the neighborhood?" Lisa's voice was laced with sarcasm. Having grown up with Diane in high school, she was all too familiar with her penchant for drama. News travels fast, Mike replied, settling into his porch chair. Well, when you get 8 texts from different neighbors in the span of 10 minutes, you know something's up. Are you really going to this meeting? Mike considered the question. He could ignore it, of course. There was nothing in the HOA bylaws that could force him to reinstall a pool, but he also knew how Diane operated. Silence would be taken as weakness, an admission of guilt. Yeah, I'm going. Someone needs to stand up to her before she convinces everyone that I'm planning to turn my yard into a junkyard. Want backup? Lisa offered. Mike smiled, grateful for his sister's support. Actually, yes. Ring that lawyer boyfriend of yours. And maybe those HOA bylaws I gave you to look over last month. The next evening arrived with ominous speed. Mike, Lisa, and her boyfriend Marcus walked up Diane's perfectly paved driveway at precisely 7 p.m. The garage had been transformed into an impromptu meeting space with folding chairs arranged in rows and a small podium at the front. Nearly every homeowner from the development was there, sipping wine from plastic cups and speaking in hushed tones. Diane spotted them immediately and straightened, her posture becoming even more rigid than usual. Her husband, Alan, a meek man who always seemed to be apologizing for his wife's behavior with his eyes, nodded uncomfortably in their direction. Well, Diane announced loudly, the man of the hour has decided to join us. Her voice carried across the garage, causing conversations to halt as all eyes turned toward Mike. Wouldn't miss it, Mike replied evenly. Nice flyer, by the way. Very dramatic. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, quickly silenced by Diane's glare. Let's get started, shall we? She tapped the microphone on the podium, producing an ear-splitting screech. We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community standards and property values. For the next 15 minutes, Diane presented what could only be described as a slideshow of horror. Pictures of rundown neighborhoods, graphs showing plummeting home prices, and most ridiculously, a photo of Mike's backyard with the empty pool spot circled in angry red, as if it were a wound on the face of their pristine development. And this is just the beginning, Diane declared, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Today it's a pool. Tomorrow it could be junk cars or, she paused dramatically, a chicken coop. Several gasps emanated from the more impressionable neighbors. That's absurd, Mike finally interjected, standing up. I removed a pool that was on my property and that I wasn't using. There's nothing in the HOA regulations against that. Actually, Diane countered smugly, as of this afternoon, I proposed an emergency amendment to the bylaws. She held up a document. It states that no homeowner may remove recreational installations without community approval if said removal could impact the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. The room fell silent. Mike felt his blood pressure rising but kept his expression neutral. This was exactly the kind of manipulative power play he'd expected. Marcus, Lisa's boyfriend, cleared his throat. May I see that amendment, please? His calm, professional tone cut through the tension. Diane hesitated, then reluctantly handed over the paper. As Marcus read, Mike noticed several neighbors exchanging uncertain glances. It seemed he wasn't the only one uncomfortable with Diane's heavy-handed approach. The battle lines had been drawn. And Mike knew that what happened next would determine not just the fate of his yard, but the power dynamic of the entire neighborhood for years to come. Marcus studied the amendment document with the careful scrutiny of someone who parsed legal language for a living. The garage had grown uncomfortably quiet, save for the occasional nervous cough or the sound of someone shifting in their folding chair. Interesting, Marcus finally said, looking up from the paper. There are several problems with this proposed amendment, Mrs. Winters. Diane's smile faltered slightly. It's quite straightforward, actually. The community has rights to preserve its character. That may be your interpretation, Marcus replied evenly, but there are 2 significant issues here. First, this amendment attempts to be retroactive, which would be applying a new rule to an action that's already been completed. That's legally unenforceable. Mike watched as several neighbors nodded in agreement. Barbara Johnson, a retired judge who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, was particularly emphatic in her approval of Marcus' point. Second, Marcus continued, the amendment is worded so vaguely that it could potentially restrict almost any change a homeowner might want to make. For instance, under this language, replacing your front door could require community approval if someone decided it affected the aesthetic consistency of the neighborhood. That's not, Diane began, but Marcus wasn't finished. Furthermore, there's a required procedure for amending HOA bylaws outlined in your own governing documents. It requires proper notice, a formal voting process, and a specific percentage of homeowner approval. This emergency meeting doesn't satisfy those requirements. Alan Winters, who had been standing awkwardly behind his wife, cleared his throat. He's right about the procedure, Diane. We discussed this. The look Diane shot her husband could have melted steel. Alan immediately retreated both physically and conversationally, becoming suddenly fascinated with the garage floor. The point, Diane said sharply, redirecting attention to herself, is that Mike's actions affect all of us. My children are devastated. They love looking at that pool from their bedroom windows. Mike couldn't help himself. Diane, your children's windows face the street. They can't even see my backyard. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter spread through the audience. Diane's face flushed crimson. Besides, Lisa interjected, since when does anyone have a right to dictate what someone else does with their private property, especially when it's not violating any existing rules? Kang Chen, who had been quiet until now, raised his hand. I'd like to say something. As the Ehinoi treasurer and one of the most respected residents in the community, his words carried weight. I've lived here for 12 years, longer than most of you. We've always prided ourselves on being reasonable neighbors. This feels like overreach. Overreach? Diane's voice rose an octave. I'm trying to protect our property values. Mike's empty dirt circle is an eyesore. Actually, Mike said, pulling out his phone and finding the photos he prepared, I'd already contacted a landscaper. I'm planning to install a stone patio with raised garden beds and a fire pit. It's going to look fantastic and be much more usable than a pool I never had time to maintain. He passed his phone around, showing the professional designs he commissioned. The response was immediate and positive. Several neighbors made appreciative comments, with a few asking for the landscaper's contact information. Diane watched in horror as her carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. That's not the point. The point is he didn't consult anyone before making this decision. Why would he need to? Barbara Johnson finally spoke up, her authoritative voice silencing the room. There's nothing in our bylaws requiring approval for removing privately owned structures. I should know. I helped write them. The meeting was slipping out of Diane's control, and she knew it. Her eyes darted around desperately, seeking allies. Finding few, she changed tactics. Fine. If you all want to see your property values plummet, that's your choice. But when he starts raising chickens or growing corn in the front yard, don't come crying to me. Mike had to admire her commitment to the slippery slope fallacy. I promise not to grow corn in my front yard, Diane. Though I might plant some tomatoes in those raised beds. More laughter. More neighbors visibly relaxing as they realized the emergency was nothing more than one woman's attempt to control her neighbor's property. Alan Winters, perhaps sensing the changing tide, stepped forward hesitantly. Maybe we should table this discussion until the regular HOA meeting next month. Give everyone time to review the proposed amendment properly. It was a face-saving suggestion, and everyone knew it. Diane opened her mouth to object, but Alan gave her a look that for once she seemed to heed. Fine, she said tersely. We'll revisit this at the May meeting. But I want it on record that I objected to this hasty dismissal of community concerns. As the impromptu meeting disbanded, neighbors gathered around Mike to see more of his landscaping plans. The positive response was overwhelming, with several people expressing their own frustrations with pool maintenance and admiring his vision for the space. Diane stood alone by her podium, watching as her carefully orchestrated community outrage dissolved into excited chatter about garden designs and stone patterns. Her face was a mask of barely contained fury. Mike knew this wasn't over. If anything, Diane's public humiliation would only fuel her determination. As he caught her eye across the garage, her expression confirmed his suspicions. This was no longer about a pool or property values. This was personal, and somehow Mike suspected that removing his pool would prove to be the least of his troubles with Diane Winters. The following week brought clear skies and perfect weather for Mike's landscaping project to begin. The trucks arrived early Monday morning, unloading pavers, soil, lumber for the raised beds, and an assortment of plants that would transform the dead circle where his pool had once stood into an outdoor oasis. Mike took the week off work to oversee the project, his excitement growing as he watched his vision take shape. By Wednesday, the stone patio was nearly complete, its circular design echoing the former pool's footprint, but with an elegant, purposeful aesthetic that already looked far better than the faded blue vinyl liner ever had. He was inspecting the mortar work between the pavers when he heard the now familiar sound of Diane's voice, pitched to carry across the yard. Excuse me, you need to stop work immediately. Mike turned to see Diane marching toward him, a man in a suit trailing behind her with a clipboard. The landscapers paused their work, tools still in hand, expressions ranging from confusion to annoyance. Is there a problem, Diane? Mike asked, maintaining a calm he didn't entirely feel. This is Mr. Peterson from the city planning office, Diane announced triumphantly. You failed to obtain the proper permits for this construction, and he's here to issue a stop work order. The man beside her looked decidedly uncomfortable. Actually, ma'am, as I was trying to explain on the way over. Show them the regulations, Diane insisted, cutting him off. Mr. Peterson sighed, clearly regretting being dragged into a neighborhood dispute. Sir, are you installing any electrical wiring, plumbing, or structural elements that would require permits? No, Mike replied, just the patio, some raised garden beds, and eventually a fire pit that's not connected to any gas line. The city official nodded, making a few notes on his clipboard. And the total square footage of the patio? About 300 square feet, well under the threshold for requiring a permit in this county. That's correct, Mr. Peterson confirmed, turning to Diane. Ms. Winters, as I tried to tell you on the phone, this type of landscaping work doesn't require city permits unless it involves structures over a certain size, changes to utilities, or disruption to drainage patterns. Diane's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: disbelief, anger, and finally, desperate determination. But what about the environmental impact? He's disturbing the soil. The city official's patience was visibly wearing thin. Ma'am, he's installing a patio and garden beds, not operating a strip mine. Several of the landscapers stifled laughs, quickly busying themselves with their work when Diane shot them a withering glare. Well, what about noise ordinances? These workers have been making a racket all week. Her voice had taken on a shrill quality that made even Mr. Peterson wince. The city noise ordinance allows for construction work between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. on weekdays, he explained, flipping through his notes. Unless they're using jackhammers or pile drivers, which I don't see here, they're well within their rights. Diane's mouth opened and closed several times before she finally found her next angle of attack. Fine, but what about the drainage issues? All this hardscaping could cause flooding in the neighborhood. This, at least, seemed to give Mr. Peterson pause. That's actually a valid concern. Sir, have you considered drainage in your design? Before Mike could answer, Carlos, the lead landscaper who had been with the project since the pool removal, stepped forward. If I may, he said, unrolling a set of plans from his truck. We've incorporated a French drain system around the perimeter of the patio that directs water to this rain garden over here. It's actually going to handle water better than the pool did, since there's no risk of overflow during heavy storms. Mr. Peterson reviewed the plans, nodding approvingly. This is excellent workmanship. You more than address any potential drainage concerns. Diane's final hope deflated visibly. But, Ms. Winters, Mr. Peterson said firmly, there are no violations here. In fact, Mr. Reynolds is making improvements that will likely enhance, not detract from, property values in this neighborhood. He turned to Mike. Your project looks great. Carry on. As the city official walked back to his car, Diane remained rooted to the spot, her face a study in thwarted rage. A few neighbors who had been discreetly watching the confrontation from their yards or windows didn't even pretend to look away now. This isn't over, Diane hissed, her voice low enough that only Mike could hear. You think you're so clever, but I know things about you, Mike Reynolds. The vague threat might have been amusing if not for the intensity in her eyes. For the first time, Mike felt a flicker of genuine concern about Diane's fixation on him and his property. Diane, he said quietly, I'm just trying to improve my home. That's all this is. You humiliated me in front of the entire neighborhood, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Nobody does that to me. Before Mike could respond, Diane spun on her heel and marched back to her house, back ramrod straight, not acknowledging the neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Carlos approached Mike as Diane's front door slammed shut. Man, she's really got out for you. I've seen neighbor disputes before, but this lady's taking it to another level. Mike nodded, feeling suddenly weary. Yeah, and I'm starting to think it's not really about the pool or the patio. There's something else going on with her. Well, for what it's worth, Carlos said, gesturing to the half-finished patio, this is going to look amazing when we're done. Worth all the drama, I promise. Mike managed to smile, but as he turned back to his project, he couldn't shake the unsettled feeling Diane's parting words had left him with. What had she meant about knowing things about him? It was probably just an empty threat, but the look in her eyes had suggested otherwise. As the landscapers returned to their work, Mike pulled out his phone and took some progress photos, sending them to Lisa with a brief summary of Diane's latest interference. His sister replied immediately. She called the city on you? That's next level crazy. Document everything. We might need it. Mike tucked his phone away, wondering what Diane might try next, and increasingly certain that this neighborhood feud was far from over.